Hi, I want to do this video on some quotes by some famous philosophers, and I think I have 11 here of famous quotes by philosophers, and I'm going to give my own opinion on them and debunk them or agree with them and see if anything I have I can have any agreeability on these statements by these philosophers. So let's start with the first one. Socrates, the unexamined life is not worth living. So the unexamined life is not worth living. I guess that means, obviously I'm just going off of these quotes. I wrote these quotes down. So the unexamined life, and I'm only going based off the quote, not coming in with any kind of pretense. So the unexamined life is not worth living. I guess an examination of your own life, right? Yeah, it's about examining your life, examining everything you do and other people do, and recognizing the mistakes you make, and doing all this, learning from your mistakes, recognition through our own point of view, and understanding what's going on around us. That if you're not recognizing, you're not self-aware and recognizing the effect that you have, that it's not a life worth living if you're not doing and taking accountability for yourself and such. So I guess that's a decent enough quote if I'm understanding it correctly. The unexamined life is not worth living, and if he's talking about if you're not being watched, it's not worth living. Sort of like how it doesn't matter if someone's watching you in the forest getting crushed by something. If they don't see it, doesn't mean anything. Obviously, it would obviously be differently when you're discussing this kind of subject. It would be the unexamined life is not worth living in what way? I guess that means the unexamined life, so I guess it's not worth living if you're not being watched. Either way, I gave my opinion on that one. I guess you can say it doesn't matter if anyone's there to watch you or not. It doesn't mean it's the living, but worth living is obviously a different distinction to make. It's not worth living, but I would say life in general isn't worth living. Speaking of, obviously, the negative sum game that we're playing. So that's Socrates, and the unexamined life is not worth living. So that's I guess a breakdown of that. I guess depending on how you look at it, you can view it as any number of different ways. So the next one is William of Ockham, and it's Occam's razor. Entities should not be multiplied unnecessarily. And this is, I guess, that has to do with the world and things we shouldn't. I guess it has to do with procreation and something like that. I mean, I'm just going based off the quote. I can't necessarily remember the idea behind Occam's razor, but it has to do with they shouldn't be multiplied. So I guess that has a lot to do with procreation, right? So we shouldn't be multiplied. We shouldn't be multiplying ourselves, and that's obviously something that we have to take into consideration. So yes, we shouldn't procreate. Yep. I mean, I might come back to that one, but I want to go on to the next one. So Thomas Hobbes, the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Yeah, it used to be. Let's go through each one of these. The life of man, any life, you can not just man, but unless he means just human beings, doesn't mean anything. It should be applied to everything. Obviously, so many other animals live shorter lives, more cruel lives, at least physically speaking, although they do live more in the moment. If you want to apply that kind of characteristic to them, a psychological characteristic to the animals, but so you have to apply that to all animals, or most animals. Speaking, obviously, you shouldn't have to make the distinction, but the animal beast is solitary. Well, depends on what you mean by solitary. What do you mean by solitary? you're not experiencing, you're experiencing all by yourself. Oh, I guess this means is if we didn't have this, if I think he's talking about if we didn't have civilization, this is the life that we would be living. And there's no other choice to have. That man's nature is very disgusting. The core of the existence that we're building off of is obviously off of these desires that we're experiencing, and there's nothing else we can do about those desires except satisfy these desires, take away from all these kinds of things, and satisfy them. And obviously, without this civilization, this integrity to civilization, and how it helps civilize human beings, and how that's obviously helping us. And without that, we would obviously be solitary, poor. We wouldn't have anything without civilization. We'd obviously be stealing. We'd be, back to our nature to begin with. Nasty, brutish, I mean the same. You can just these are pretty much the same words, the same synonym. They're pretty much synonyms. Brutish, obviously, like going back to nature, crap like that, and short. And obviously, we lived shorter lives when we were living as cavemen, back in the very BC days. So yeah, that's a good enough explanation to break down. I guess I generally agree with that statement. Yes, we are brutish creatures at heart, and that's based off of the nature that we've existed with, and how civilization has minimized those. At least, we're fighting against them more, and the recognition of being smarter, recognizing it, and recognizing more of what we are, and fighting against it using civilization at the core. We are nasty beasts, and where we would be just as bad as any animal you might find at the zoo or something like that, out in the wild. Rene Descartes is the next quote. The person, I think, therefore I am. Yes, but I would argue that there's not an am. There's not necessarily a you. There's a brain. I guess it's a matter of semantics. But me brain think, therefore me brain am. I guess that's a way of looking at it. So, I think, therefore I am. Of course I am, but that's no reason to. I think I disregard this quote just based off of its, almost entire, overt. It's overt. It's overt disregard of outside beings. It's almost in a way saying the implication of this quote, I would say, is that you shouldn't care. Who's to say that the other person existing? It's almost saying defend yourself and screw everyone else. That's the implication I get from the quote. Obviously, you think, therefore you are. There's no you. There's a brain based on a deterministic mechanism working based on the mechanisms of the world and the universe, the reality that we live in, the only reality that can exist and where we are. And I think, therefore, I am. Yeah, okay, based on the statement alone, okay. Just change a few words, and then you have the statement meaning something, but it's no reason to disregard anyone. The implication I disagree with, and the quote, just change a few things, semantics, crap, and you have pretty much something that I could understand. George Berkeley, to be is to be perceived. And this is a guy that I think used the tree falling in the forest, and how the only thing that exists is mind and their ideas, and there's nothing more, sort of like saying, if you're not there to experience the tree falling, you're not there to hear it and understand it, then the tree didn't fall in the forest, and it's something that didn't happen because there was no witness. And I completely disagree with this. It still happened. Sort of like it still happened even though you're dead, or it still happened even though you're not in the negative circumstance that you were to begin with. It's obviously something that still matters. It still happened. And just because it's done and over with doesn't mean anything. It led up to where you are now, causing the thing that caused, obviously that caused you to be where you are now, and based off of all other kinds of events that happened outside of yourself. But obviously it still means something. You still went through the pain, and the pain in and of itself is obviously the thing you have to consider when considering the pain. You can't just say it's gone. Obviously, looking back retrospectively, it can seem like it's gone, it's past, and it's easier to look back and experience the pain than actually experiencing the pain in the moment. And that's obviously something, and recognizing and perceiving, maybe this will never end. If you have no understanding of the pain and ailment, this will never end, I'm going to die. All sorts of psychological recognitions when it comes to this as well. So I don't agree with that. It's still happening. It still has meaning. It doesn't mean anything just because a person's not there to witness some kind of pain, especially when the pain is being experienced by someone else. You don't need to be there for that person to be experiencing the pain. They just need to have awareness and understanding and the sensation of having that pain that they're experiencing. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, we live in the best of all possible worlds. And I think based on the summation of this quote that I read, has a lot to do with the idea of God considered all possible outcomes, and he chose to choose this one because he considered this the best, and he chose through all infinite number of outcomes, and he chose the best one. Well, no, he didn't. The best one I can even conceive of more easily than God apparently can if he's choosing the best possible outcome. And the best possible outcome is for, first of all, I would say, for there to not be any life. If we can consider some kind of alternate reality where we can exist, and some kind of transient, this idea of not existing, but existing without some kind of deprivation. Obviously, God's not being controlled by the mechanism of the universe. He's controlling and creating the mechanisms of the universe. But God is created out of the mechanisms of the universe based off some idea of some human form. God is some kind of form that has human characteristics, especially when you go down to the creationist Bible, where he obviously has a lot of human characteristics in describing and how he resolves things and experiences things, and how he smites those that use his name in vain, and has a lot of human characteristics going based off that through the implications of the statement, understanding it might be Christianity, that he's considering God, unless he's just a deist. But obviously people's interpretation obviously get wishy-washy in understanding this, but I'm assuming he's Christian, and I wholeheartedly disagree, because if I can conceive of it, God conceiving it, just because God can't prove it to us, because obviously he knows best, and he can't just say it and have us to believe it, and blah 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 blah. Obviously, we're not God, and we're the ones experiencing His word, and we're just the ones at His glory and blah blah blah. He's controlling everything we're doing right now. Obviously, I can already explain that through determinism. We don't need God to explain all these processes that are going on. You're only adding one extra step to the process when you don't need anything else with the egg cracking open that causing the universe. You don't need someone else. You're just causing something else. Well, what was he doing beforehand, and so on and so forth. You don't need the extra God in the middle of this kind of discussion of philosophy. So we don't live in the best possible worlds, especially when I can consider best possible world being either no world. God couldn't have considered, obviously, that why would he create a world if he can only consider the best possible world a crappy world that he's existing with all the suffering and obviously the torture and torment that we're experiencing now, and obviously it's a zero-sum game, and that's proof enough that God wasn't thinking thoroughly enough, or he was obviously stoned, or he was completely wasted when he made this world that we were living in, this universe. He was completely out of his freaking mind. So if I can think of it, God can't think of it. Just because God can't prove it to me doesn't mean jack crap to me, or it shouldn't mean anything to anyone. Just because you take God's word doesn't mean what God says is right, based on, say, a religious text of saying, or it's based on a philosophy interpreting a religious text. It doesn't mean anything that this person is saying means anything. And just because you're not there, and God has no God should be able to irrefutably, be able to explain this to you. And if he can't explain it to you, or provide proof, and if he's the one that brought us here, he obviously should explain, other than interpreting through the interpretations of some kind of philosopher, how this has anyway rings true for any kind of reasonable conversation and consideration for understanding the world we live in, and how it's the best possible world when I can consider a best possible world, unless God's just trying to delude my brain, make me play out the role of a deluded retard or something. Obviously that's not a consideration to consider. So I could go on in this one, but obviously because it's religious text kind of stuff, but I'm not going to go on in that. That's obviously something to consider, and blah blah blah. Obviously I've refuted it enough as far as I'm concerned. So the next one is G.W.F. Hegel. The owl of Minerva spreads its wings only with the falling of the dusk. I don't remember much about the summation of this. The owl of Minerva spreads its wing with only the falling of the dusk. I don't know if I can say anything on that. The owl of Minerva. spreads its wings with the falling of the dusk. I wrote this wrong. Spreads its with the only the falling of the dusk. I don't know much about that. I have no idea. So on to the next one. Soren Kierkegaard, who is also aware of the tremendous risk involved in faith when he nevertheless makes the leap of faith. This is subjectivity at its height. So I guess he's talking about, I think it said something about the stages of life and experience the stages of life and so on and so forth. So obviously, based on the quote in and of itself, it says it's basically it's basically insulting and mocking faith, and how faith is a silly thing to guide you and use to as a tool of living through a life, a mechanism of comfort to live your life through. And when he nevertheless makes the leap of faith, this is subjectivity at its height. So when he makes the leap of faith, obviously he's subjectively implying, or he's So when you're making this leap of faith, when you're taking the word of some kind of God based off a religious text, based off of faith notion in your mind, of projecting some kind of value on the words of this kind of this idea, being almost deluded by the idea, being fooled into feeling like faith is a good enough reason, you're almost acting out of some kind of subjective state of mind based off of this faith that's subjective, that we can't necessarily put our finger on, this faith based on your own interpretation of something. Unless it's a literal interpretation that we are all the standards that we've all that someone would come to. But taking the leap of faith is obviously considered a subjective act based on our own perceptions. Obviously, I have a subjective point of view, they have a subjective point of view. We fall for this faith and understanding some kind of concept of world theory, of understanding the world we're living in, and we take it at its core, at face value, and we're doing nothing but falling for it, and it's subjective when we're applying this faith to our own being and existing in a world. So I generally agree with that, I would say. I don't think there's much else to say on that one. Friedrich Nietzsche, God is dead. And yeah, God is dead. I can generally agree with Nietzsche on that statement. Obviously, God is dead, and this was back in the mid to late 1800s, 19th century, and he was pretty much saying God is on the decline, and it didn't have the same power. It wasn't overwhelming. It wasn't just a scientific fact or theory that we obviously took as the entire truth. It's on the decline. We're not necessarily buying it. And I would say we were buying it even less than some to the extent back in the 1800s when this quote was, or at least vicariously said through the mouth of Friedrich Nietzsche. Zarathustra's, I think, is what the summation said about the God is dead. He spoke it through the words he generally agreed with. He backed up the statement. So, yes, God is on the decline, and it's still on the decline today, and God is super dead now, if by any standards, comparing it to the God is dead back in the 1800s. So yes, God is super dead at this point, almost completely buried and burned and turned into ashes. So yes, generally agree with that statement. Albert Camus. There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. It's sort of like, I guess that said something about going through the absurdity of life and experiencing one step at a time, and there's only one way to deal with it, and the only thing that you can do is suicide, dying in the end, live through life. It's sort of like an existential argument. I think someone like Ernest Hemingway had a similar kind of idea of viewing the world, and it's this idea of, just living through life's absurdity. Live it, there's no this, there's no that. So you're just going through life's absurdity, and you're living out your own existence. And you have to, almost in a way, there's one aspect, I think, in the summation of this argument that explains it well enough, and that's going through hardship to, going through the pushing the boulder, push the boulder up the hill only for it to fall down, so you have to push the boulder back up, and that's the only reason how we can, a reasonable interpretation of the summation, and that's the only way we can find any sort of meaning in life, and I generally agree with that statement. Other than that, the absurdity of life, and obviously it's not necessarily absurdist deterministic. Absurd, I guess, would mean some kind of chaotic random that we're existing in. Other than the implications based on that, I generally agree with the statement and the implications made by the quote. But other than that, obviously there's the suicide thing. Obviously, that's an answer. Suicide is one of the answers to the elimination of life, as long as you don't have to go through all sorts of, go through a lack of a degrading of dignity to reach that. So, Herodotus, one cannot step twice into the same river. It's pretty much saying that life is fleeting and impermanent, and the existence, the very nature, if anything, if it was not added in the summation of this quote, would be that life is fleeting. But it's not just life from our own perspective, it's life in general. It doesn't need us for it to be fleeting. Things are still moving. It's still a constant based off of movement, things moving. One constant effect leading to the absurdity, all these different, not absurdity, but chaos from our point of view and recognition. I guess you can apply to this quote. This one cause movement effect after the essential cause leading to an inevitable predetermined end that we have. And we're all living out the movement cause. And the only thing that can be the effect is one large event, the continuous event from cause to end, and the effect is the thing that happens after the initial cause, and the only thing that is the cause is the one moment in time. If you want to say you can capture a moment in time, and the initial cause that happened, if we're living in a universe that expanded and caused to exist, and such and so forth, but ignoring that entirely, based on the first event. And then the first event was the cause, and we're living out the constant movement, the effect. The effect is movement in and of itself as well, and we're living out that effect to an inevitable end. And I would say that's obviously something to consider. So I think that's all I need to add on these quotes. And that's 11 quotes that I wrote down. Obviously, there's one or two that I didn't necessarily finish the idea, but I got the basic idea on. And maybe if anyone has any ideas that I missed, I would appreciate you informing me. If there's anything I misinterpreted or anything, I took people's words. I'm obviously arguing with dead people now. All of these people are dead, and I'm just sort of going based off the quotes more than anything. So it's just my quick interpretation of these quotes and understanding them and breaking them down and seeing what they have to say. So that's all I have to say. So thank you, and until next time, goodbye.